The morning mist rolled across Yokosuka Naval Base like a silk curtain, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the weight of unspoken farewells. It was March 1945, and 18-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka stood at attention with 49 other young men, their eyes fixed on the peculiar vessels before them. They looked nothing like the mighty warships he had dreamed of commanding as a child. These were Kaiten, human torpedoes barely 20 feet long, with room for just one pilot and enough explosives to sink an enemy destroyer. Hiroshi's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the ceremonial white headband his mother had tied around his forehead that morning. She had said nothing, her fingers working the fabric with practiced precision, while tears streamed silently down her weathered cheeks. His father had turned away, unable to watch his only son prepare for what everyone knew was a one-way mission. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura paced before them, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. He was a decorated officer, his chest heavy with medals that caught the weak sunlight. His face was carved from stone, emotions buried beneath layers of duty and honor. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent formation like a blade cutting through water. You have been chosen for the greatest honor a warrior can receive. The Kaiten program represents our final stand against the American fleet threatening our homeland. Each of you will become a living weapon, a divine wind that will turn the tide of this war. Hiroshi glanced sideways at his childhood friend, Kenji Yamamoto, who stood rigid beside him. They had grown up together in the farming villages of Nagano Prefecture, climbing the same mountains, fishing in the same streams, dreaming the same dreams of serving their emperor. Now they would die together, though neither would speak this truth aloud. The training facility stretched behind them, a collection of wooden barracks and concrete bunkers built into the hillside. For 3 months they had practiced in simulation chambers, learning to navigate by periscope alone, to calculate distances and speeds in seconds, to accept their fate with dignity. The instructors never mentioned survival. There was no emergency exit, no escape hatch, no rescue protocol. The Kaiten was designed with a single purpose: to strike the enemy with devastating force, and to take its pilot with it. That afternoon, they were taken to see the vessels up close. Hiroshi ran his hand along the cold metal hull, feeling the rivets beneath his palm. Inside, he could see the cramped cockpit, barely enough room to sit, with a tiny periscope, basic controls, and a detonation switch within easy reach. The oxygen supply would last perhaps 6 hours if he was lucky. Most pilots would use it all within 3. Do you understand what you are looking at, Tanaka? Commander Nakamura appeared beside him, his shadow falling across the torpedo. Hiroshi straightened immediately. Yes, sir. This is my path to glory. The commander's expression flickered for just a moment, something that might have been sorrow passing behind his eyes before the mask returned. Glory. Yes, that is what we tell ourselves. Before Hiroshi could respond, Nakamura moved on, leaving him alone with the machine that would become his coffin. Around him, other recruits touched their assigned Kaiten with reverence, with fear, with resignation. Some whispered prayers. Others stood in silence, their faces pale despite their resolve. That evening, in the cramped barracks they called home, the men gathered to write their final letters. Hiroshi sat on his thin mattress, a single sheet of paper before him, his fountain pen hovering uncertainly. What could he say to his mother? That he was proud to die? That she should not grieve? The words felt hollow even in his mind. Kenji sat across from him, his own letter already sealed and addressed. He had always been faster at everything, running, swimming, making decisions. Now he was faster at accepting death. What did you write? Hiroshi asked quietly. Kenji looked up, his eyes distant. I thanked them for raising me, for loving me, for giving me the strength to do this. Hiroshi nodded slowly, then bent over his paper and began to write. His mother's face filled his mind. Not as she had been that morning, broken and weeping, but as she was in his earliest memories, laughing as she chased him through rice fields, her kimono flying behind her like wings. Outside, the ocean whispered against the shore, endless and indifferent. Tomorrow they would begin their final preparations. Within weeks, they would be loaded onto submarines and transported to enemy waters. Within months, Most of them would be gone, their names added to lists that would grow longer as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. But tonight, they were still alive, still breathing, still able to feel the rough fabric of their uniforms and taste the simple rice and fish that had been their dinner. Tonight, they could still pretend that tomorrow might be different. The reality of their situation crashed down like a wave 3 weeks into advanced training. Commander Nakamura gathered them in the briefing room, a stark concrete chamber lit by a single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows across the walls. On the table before him lay photographs, grainy, water-damaged images recovered from previous missions. "These are the results of our first Kaiten operations," Nakamura announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "Operation Congo near Ulithi Atoll. 8 pilots deployed." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Hiroshi felt his chest tighten, knowing what was coming but unable to stop listening. 1 confirmed hit. The USS Mississiniua. 1,000 American casualties. The commander's finger moved across the photographs. 7 pilots lost to mechanical failure, depth miscalculation, or premature detonation. Their sacrifice bought us 1 victory. The math was brutal, inescapable. An 87% fatality rate, and that was considered a successful mission. Hiroshi looked around the room at faces draining of color, at hands gripping the edges of tables, at eyes that could no longer meet each other. But the worst revelation came next. Nakamura pulled out another folder, this one thicker, filled with technical reports written in precise military terminology that barely concealed the horror beneath. "The Kaiten has significant design flaws that were never resolved before production," he continued, his jaw tight. "The oxygen rebreather system fails in 70% of trials. The gyroscope malfunctions in cold water. The periscope lens fogs after 30 minutes submerged. The detonation mechanism has a delayed trigger that often activates too early or too late." Kenji stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Sir, are you saying we were sent here to die in machines that do not even work properly?" Nakamura's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that could have melted steel. "Sit down, Yamamoto." "No, sir." Kenji's voice shook but held firm. "My father died at Midway believing his sacrifice meant something. My brother died at Iwo Jima fighting for our homeland. I volunteered for this program because I believed I could make a difference. But you are telling us we are being loaded into coffins that will kill us before we ever reach the enemy." The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in that room was thinking the same thing, but only Kenji had dared to speak it. Hiroshi watched his friend stand there, defiant and terrified in equal measure, and felt something crack inside his own carefully constructed resolve. Nakamura walked slowly toward Kenji until they stood face to face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of mountains. "You are correct, Yamamoto. This program has a 95% mortality rate. Most of you will die without ever seeing an enemy ship. But the Empire demands it, and we will obey." That night, everything changed. Hiroshi couldn't sleep, his mind replaying Nakamura's words over and over like a broken record. 95%. The number felt like a death sentence, not the honorable sacrifice they had been promised. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the wooden beams above, listening to the restless movements of 50 young men who had just learned they were expendable. Around 2 in the morning, he heard quiet footsteps approaching his bunk. It was Kenji, his face pale in the darkness, eyes red from crying or anger or both. "Come with me," Kenji whispered. "I found something." They slipped out of the barracks like shadows, moving through the base with the stealth they had learned during night training exercises. Kenji led him to a small maintenance building near the water's edge, its door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, scattered across a workbench, were technical documents marked with red stamps, classified materials that should never have been accessible to recruits. "Look at this," Kenji said, his hands shaking as he spread the papers under a weak flashlight beam. "These are internal reports from the Naval Engineering Division. They knew about every single flaw before the first Kaiten was ever deployed. The oxygen system, the navigation problems, the premature detonations, all documented, all ignored." Hiroshi scanned the documents, his blood turning cold. There were recommendations for design improvements, urgent requests for additional testing, warnings about catastrophic failure rates. Every single report had been stamped with the same response. Proceed with current specifications. Strategic timeline cannot be delayed. They sent men to die in machines they knew were broken. Hiroshi breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. This is not honor. This is murder. Kenji looked at him with eyes that held a desperate question. So what do we do? Run? Refuse? Expose this? Before Hiroshi could answer, a voice cut through the darkness like a knife. Neither. Both young men spun around to find Commander Nakamura standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Hiroshi's heart hammered against his ribs, certain they would be executed for treason. But Nakamura didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. I left those documents where you would find them, Yamamoto. The commander moved to the window, looking out at the dark ocean. You deserve to know the truth before you make your final choice. What choice? Kenji asked bitterly. We are soldiers. We follow orders. Nakamura turned to face them, and for the first time, Hiroshi saw the man beneath the uniform. Exhausted, haunted, carrying the weight of hundreds of deaths on his shoulders. There is always a choice, the commander said quietly. Even in war. Especially in war. What you do with that choice defines who you are. If you are watching this story and wondering what you would do in their position, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and survival. The real turning point is just beginning. Commander Nakamura sat down heavily on a wooden crate, suddenly looking decades older than his 40 years. He pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket. A young man in naval uniform, smiling with the optimism of someone who believed his future was bright. My son, Nakamura said quietly. Lieutenant Takashi Nakamura. He was in the first Kaiten deployment at Ulithi. His torpedo malfunctioned 30 meters from launch. The oxygen system failed. He suffocated inside that metal tube while still attached to the submarine. The crew could hear him screaming through the hull for 20 minutes before he went silent. Hiroshi felt his stomach turn. Kenji's face had gone completely white. The Navy recorded him as having died gloriously in battle against enemy forces. They gave my wife a medal and told her our son was a hero. But I read the real report. I know he died trapped and terrified, killed by our own negligence disguised as patriotism. The commander stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Since that day, I have been assigned to train new Kaiten pilots. Every group of young men I send out, I see my son's face. I see him in every one of you, and I am powerless to stop it. Then why tell us this? Hiroshi found his voice, though it came out rough and unsteady. Why not just let us believe the lie? Nakamura's eyes locked onto his. Because you deserve the chance my son never had. The chance to choose your own path with full knowledge of what you face. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the training program. Nakamura began teaching them things that were not in the official manual: how to fake equipment malfunctions, how to abort a launch sequence and make it look like mechanical failure, how to survive in open water if they had to abandon their Kaiten before reaching the target. He did this in whispers during night exercises, in coded language that could be dismissed as routine safety protocols if anyone questioned it. But not everyone chose survival. Some recruits, like Yoshiro Matsuda and Takeo Honda, remained devoted to their original mission. They saw Nakamura's subtle sabotage as treason, as a corruption of their sacred duty. The group began to fracture, tension building between those who wanted to live and those who were determined to die with honor. The breaking point came during a simulation exercise. Matsuda confronted Kenji in front of the entire unit, accusing him of cowardice, of dishonoring his family name, of betraying the emperor himself. The words cut deep, striking at the very foundation of everything they had been raised to believe. Kenji stood trembling, caught between two impossible choices. His voice, when it finally came, was steady and clear. I would rather live as a coward than die as a fool in a broken machine built by men who valued propaganda over our lives. Matsuda struck him across the face, the crack echoing across the training ground like a gunshot. The strike changed everything. Hiroshi lunged forward, catching Kenji before he fell, his own rage boiling over. He turned on Matsuda with fire in his eyes, ready to fight. But Commander Nakamura's voice cut through the chaos like thunder. Enough! All of you dismissed. Tanaka, Yamamoto, Matsuda, my office. Now. The three of them stood at attention in the cramped office while Nakamura paced behind his desk. Outside, the sun was setting over Yokosuka Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire and blood. War makes monsters of us all, Nakamura began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. It makes us forget that the enemy soldiers we fight are also someone's sons, someone's brothers. And worse, it makes us turn on our own people when they dare to question whether our deaths serve any real purpose. Matsuda's jaw tightened. Sir, with respect, our purpose is clear. We die for the Emperor, for our families, for Japan. And when Japan surrenders, Nakamura's question hung in the air like smoke. When this war ends, and it will end, Matsuda, probably within months, what will your death have accomplished? Will it have saved a single life? Will it have changed the outcome? The young pilot's face crumbled, anger giving way to something deeper, more painful. You think we will lose? I know we will lose. Nakamura moved to the window, looking out at the Kaiten torpedoes lined up along the dock. The Americans have atomic weapons now. Cities are being erased from existence in seconds. Our navy is destroyed, our air force decimated, our people starving. And still, the high command demands more sacrifices, more glorious deaths, more young men loaded into defective machines. He turned back to face them, and Hiroshi saw tears streaming down the commander's weathered face. The first emotion the man had shown since that terrible briefing weeks ago. 3 days from now, you will be deployed. 12 Kaiten will be loaded onto submarines bound for the Philippine Sea. Cannot stop this. But I can give you information. I can tell you that American destroyers patrol in patterns. I can show you where the deepest currents run, where a man might survive if he abandoned his vessel. I can teach you how to appear dead if you are captured, how to wait for rescue, how to live. So you want us to abandon our missions? Kenji asked quietly. I want you to survive, Nakamura said simply. I want you to return home when this insanity finally ends. I want you to have families, to grow old, to tell your children about the war without having to lie about dying gloriously. Is that so terrible? Matsuda stood silent for a long moment, his entire worldview collapsing around him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. My father will never forgive me if I come home alive. Then live for yourself, Nakamura replied. Your father's honor is not worth your life. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing surrender. The war was over. Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a military hospital in Okinawa, his body weak from malnutrition and exposure, but alive. Miraculously, impossibly alive. Of the 12 Kaiten pilots deployed that April morning, only 6 had made it into the water. Of those 6, 3 had followed Nakamura's secret instructions, faking equipment failures, abandoning their torpedoes in deep water, and surfacing far from their targets. Hiroshi had spent 4 days floating on debris before an American destroyer picked him up. Kenji had been rescued by a fishing boat 2 days later. Matsuda never came back. He had chosen honor over survival, his Kaiten detonating against an empty supply ship that sank without taking a single life. His name was added to the lists, his family given a medal, his death recorded as glorious. 10 years later, Hiroshi stood outside a small school in Nagano Prefecture, watching children play in the courtyard. He was a teacher now, something he never imagined during those dark days at Yokosuka. Beside him stood Kenji, who had become a carpenter, rebuilding homes in villages destroyed by the war. Do you ever think about him? Kenji asked quietly. Nakamura? Every day, Hiroshi replied. The commander had been court-martialed after the war when the truth about his sabotage came to light. He had been stripped of rank, imprisoned for 2 years, his name forever stained with dishonor. But he had saved 17 lives across 3 training groups before being discovered. 17 young men who went home to their families instead of dying in broken machines. The The school bell rang, and children rushed toward them, laughing and shouting with the careless joy of those who had never known war. Among them was Hiroshi's daughter, 6 years old, with her mother's smile and his dark eyes. She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the classroom. "Papa, are you coming to see my drawings?" Of course, he smiled, letting her lead him forward. That night, Hiroshi added another entry to the journal he had kept for a decade. He wrote about survival, about the 95% who never came home, about the guilt of living when so many died. But he also wrote about hope, about second chances, about the commander who had risked everything to give them a choice. "We were told that dying for our country was the highest honor," he wrote. "But Commander Nakamura taught us something more important, that living for our country, rebuilding it, raising children who would never know the horror of war, that was the real victory." The Kaiten program killed thousands of young men in machines designed to fail. But some of us survived, and we carry their memory forward, not through glorious death, but through the simple act of living well. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If it moved you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have chosen in their position? And suggest topics for future videos. These stories matter, and your engagement helps keep them alive. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest courage is not in how we die, but in how we choose to live.